Our next lecturer is Dr. Michael Kigel. His lecture is titled Keter, a new epistemic source for the humanities. Sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
Dr. Michael Kigel is a chair of Jewish studies at the Lauder Business School in Vienna. He's earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of Toronto and has taught courses in philosophy and Jewish studies in the University of Toronto, York University, Queen's University, and the University of Waterloo. He's currently working on a book about the dialogue between Elie Wiesel and the Lubavitch Rebbe in the aftermath of the Holocaust.
Thank you. I'd like to do three things. I'll tell you them backwards. I'd like to just read a couple of texts together from Chassidus, mostly from the Alter Rebbe, actually mostly from the Rebbe Rashab, also the Alter Rebbe, and one text from the Rebbe. But to do that, I want to give you a short philosophy 101 lecture on the history of philosophy, so that hopefully the Chassidic texts will speak for themselves. And before I do that, I just want to give a short introduction. Please forgive me, I teach very basic intro to Judaism courses, and I have to make very fancy PowerPoint presentations for them to do that. So it's just a bad habit with me. I know, this kind of crowd doesn't need these kind of presentations, but you'll forgive me if I actually put up some images here. But they're helpful because the texts that I'm going to talk about, there's some key texts. So I'll put them out here I think it helps to see the text sometimes and hear it at the same time. And if I get carried away with the philosophy part, can you please stop me at the 20-minute mark or 25-minute mark? Because I want to get the Hasidic text. I might lose track of time. Also, okay, thank you. And also, please forgive me. I'm going to, actually, no. Let's start with this, okay? First of all, prefatory note before we actually begin reading. If you go to Google Maps, you'll find Lubavitch right here on the map. Not far from Yadi, which is the place where the Alter Rebbe is from, but 30 kilometers away. As you can see, the border between Belarus and Russia is right in between them. And what I find very interesting is that if you also go to Google, you Google academia, you'll find that academia is 3 kilometers west of the Acropolis in Athens. Something we tend to forget about. We tend to forget that there's actually a geographical comparison that we can make between Lubavitch and academia. That happens for very important reasons, the fact that we forget that. Now, by the way, let me just go back here for a second before I go to Raffaello. So, as you probably know, in Lubavitch is one of the reasons that it's very important is that the Rebbe Rashab, and I want to thank Eli for correcting me on this one, the Rebbe Rashab founded the Tomchei Tmimim in the year 1897. And in academia, and the word academia, the word dim, means, it's like the word democracy comes from the word dim. It means borough or district. So this is a little district outside of Athens where Plato, in the year 387 BCE, founded his original academy. As you can see, there's a lot of time in between them. And I want to point this out because I think it's not fair. It's not fair that Plato has a huge advantage over Chabad. Chabad is only 240 years old, maximum, that's going back to the youth of the Alter Rebbe, and Plato is 2,400 years old. There's a tenfold difference. In 2,400 years, you can forget what academia is. So, if Hafatza Mayanos goes correctly, then maybe at some point we'll forget what Lubavitch is, right? Because it'll be all over the place, be like fish in the water, you don't know what water is. So just to clarify this, to put historically here, what is Athens? In the 16th century, Raphael made this beautiful painting which is found in the Vatican apartments, depicting all the great players in the intellectual world up until that time. And this wasn't a Chiddush. People could look at this painting. I'm sure when he invited the Pope could identify everybody in this painting. You have a Euclid here doing some mathematics. Sorry, this side of Euclid, I think this is Pythagoras working with a compass on the ground. This is Ptolemy spinning a globe, and so on. All the players are here. And of course, the two main players, the ones who are right in the middle, this is the foundation of academia, literally, and also historically, intellectually. We have Plato and Aristotle. Apparently, Raphael modeled his image of Plato on Leonardo da Vinci. I don't know if you know the painting of some portrait of da Vinci. It looks a bit like this. So we find these two guys right in the center, and of course, he is the student of Plato. Now, Aristotle has a very important student. He's not a great academic, but he does something quite tremendous in history, namely Alexander, the Macedonian. In the year 334 BCE, when he crosses the Hellespont and he decides to take on the whole world, not only do his armies enter the world, that's really not so interesting. What's really interesting about it is what happens is what I would call, big, nothing word, the de-geographization of academic thought. At this point, it becomes possible to forget that when we say the word academy, that we're talking about Plato. We think, oh yeah, academy, we're all academics. Well, what does that mean, we're all academics? Because thanks to Alexander, it was denationalized. The whole academic approach was denationalized. You're no longer a Greek if you're an academic, as we know, for example, in Hanukkah. When we talk about the Yevanim in Hanukkah, we're not talking about the Yevanim at all. Right? These are the Syriac Jews and the assimilated Jews. There are no actual Greeks from Greece. And that's because academia now is a state of mind. It's a state of mind that is universal. And I want to point out one thing, though. I'm not trying to suggest any kind of historicist reduction here. I don't want to suggest that it's all totally subjective. On the one hand, you have the subjectivity of thought on the academic school, and then you have the other subjectivities, and everybody's parachute is beautiful and isn't it just wonderful? Not at all. This could be quite objective. But the point is just to become sensitized to the medium in which we are operating. And I want to show you here a cute little video clip that I found from a movie that's just put out.
You a choice.
This is just the intro to the movie, but
Put
this
on
is.
these glasses or start eating that trash can.
I already am eating from the trash can.
This is
all the time.
Slavoj Žižek. I
The
don't know if you
name
guys
of
have
this
heard of him.
trash
He's
can
a
is
modern,
ideology.
brilliant philosopher from Slovenia,
The
not far
material
from
force of
where I live.
ideology
And he does this whole
makes
movie
me
to make this one point here.
not see what I'm effectively eating. It's not only our reality which enslaves us. The tragedy of our predicament when we are within ideology is that when we think that we escape it into our dreams, at that point we are within ideology.
That's the main point, okay? When we escape, yeah, it's very cute. I haven't even seen this whole film, but it's a very nice film. It goes through all these movies, makes wonderful points. When we think we escape ideology, he has an accent. When we believe we've finally escaped ideology, that's when we're deepest in ideology. That's when we're completely oblivious to the fact that we are standing with our feet right in a strong ideological, we could say dogmatic position. Right? So the point is to become a little bit aware of this. Okay, now I've changed my title and my subtitle for this, if you don't mind. I made it a little bit more fanatical, a little bit crazier. I want to talk about that in the relationship to Keter. And the idea here is, as I say, toward a Chabad revitalization of academic thought. And I'm going to read. The subtitle for my paper on that, on the Chabad epistemic category of that, speaks of a revitalization of academic thought. By this, I simply mean to get to the issue of life that is at stake in this paper right away, of life, or better yet, of vitality. It's not a question here of something that is dead, but only of its suffering under compromised life. I mean the issue of the diminished vitality of Western thought, which, for example, Edwin Husserl was so troubled by in his last great work, The Crisis of European Sciences. As Husserl himself puts it, the sciences have lost their meaning. He calls it, this is a subsection of his book. In German, you can see die Krisis der Wissenschaft als Verlust ihrer Lebensbedeutsamkeit, the loss of its meaningfulness or importance for life. But by this, he doesn't mean that the sciences are failing. Not at all. On the contrary, with every year and every generation, the sciences are more and more successful. And this is the problem, precisely their success of the sciences. Their success and the success of Western thought remains as impressive, but no longer as meaningful for life. And just to give two simple little silly analogies, think of a businessman who's very successful, making a lot of money, business going very well, or an academic who's very successful, writing a lot of books, being very successful, but for some reason, his or her success fails to impress their children, with whom they have very little time to spend because they're either busy writing books or developing companies. So success is relative. You know, who are you impressing, who are you not impressing? Or, to put it another way, more pertinent to my point here, think of an athlete who develops a certain part of their body or certain ability, and at the expense of their general health. One of my favorite examples, I don't want to show you what these feet really look like, but if you know what a ballerina's feet actually look like, they're these horrible mangled feet. because she's doing amazing things with the rest of her body, and her feet, as a result, are suffering. Now, my thesis is that Chabad Hasidus can give back the sciences their vitality, their meaning for life. To this end, accordingly, my argument, as I mentioned, will come in two parts. First, a diagnosis of the condition of compromised vitality, which I will attribute to a kind of physiological failure in the epistemic organ that it has resulted from, in this organ's being squeezed and shrunken by unchecked pressures exerted by an adjacent organ, a powerful, important, and potentially trouble-causing epistemic organ that is sometimes called thought or critical thinking, and which I will describe as the intellectual faculty that Chabad Hasidus calls Bina. The second part, as I mentioned, will then simply offer a small sampling of texts from the Rebbe Rashab, and the Alter Rebbe, as prescriptions for a kind of therapy aimed at rebuilding the atrophied organ, the organ that the Lurianic tradition and Chabad Hasidus after it calls Da'at. And just to recommend my metaphor here, my medical metaphor, not only does Husserl speak of this, many people talk about it, the idea of an organ, the medieval students of Aristotle spoke of an organon, by which they meant the tools, the apparatus of logical thinking and so on. And then Francis Bacon, well after them, came back with us to the same word, with the novum organum, the new organ. So what does this mean now that the European sciences are in crisis? Where European, in Husserl's title I'm talking about here, of course signifies Western, and I guess we would say international today. And Wissenschaften, in Husserl's title, includes the Geisteswissenschaften. In fact, they're probably at the head of the list, the humanities. What exactly is this low vitality suffered by Western thought? And why should Chabad Hasidus, of all things, offer the best treatment for this condition? The idea that academic thought is ill is, Baruch Hashem, in no way original to me. I say Baruch Hashem because it would be too big of a task for me to actually, too big of a chutzpah for me to actually prove this. To unpack this well-established medical approach to the issue, it must suffice for me to confess my sympathies for a critical tradition that begins in the 1870s with Nietzsche's first examination of the unhappy condition. I think this is part one here. So Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, was the first great European Western academic mind to diagnose the morbus of Western thought. Indeed, that the vitality of Western civilization in general, not just academic echelons, is a morbus, a life not yet dead but compromised by death, is a key theme in Nietzsche. Anybody who knows Nietzsche. And not long after him, Freud, to mention another important physician of the same condition, would call it, in an understated tone, Western civilization's Unbehagen, its discontent. And Nietzsche, of course, was the first great surgeon. He didn't just diagnose the situation, but he tried to perform some surgery. I'm not sure how successful it was. I suspect it wasn't very successful, but I'm not going to focus on his surgery here. If a surgical procedure has proven to be too destructive, the value of Nietzsche's diagnosis remains quite intact and quite indispensable, especially for an application of what I'm calling a Chabad therapy here. The power of this diagnosis specifically lies in its ability to penetrate the etiology of its illness with such long fingers that it reaches all the way back into its congenital origins, its birth defect, which had been waiting since the birth of Western thought like a congenital, silent, and morbid irregularity deep inside the organism of Western thought, until it finally turned openly and actively malignant in somewhere around the 19th century, say, sometime after Hegel. This is what makes Nietzsche's diagnosis far more profound, for example, than Spengler's account of the Untergang of the West, not to mention the epidemic of intellectual despair that broke out over the West after the 2 world wars. I mean, the whole movement that is often called deconstruction, postmodernity, and so on. Now, how did Nietzsche characterize this more than bimillennial disease? So I want to stress, this is Nietzsche's Chiddush. Unlike these other thinkers, many people have said, oh yes, Western thought is sick, it's ill. Nietzsche's brilliance was to say, well, actually it's been ill since the beginning, right since the very, very beginning. It's just that the illness did not show itself until the last century or so, last 2 centuries. How did Nietzsche characterize this long-standing disease? In various ways, to be sure, but one formula does stand apart, if only for its fame and infamy. I mean, of course, the by now widely known and still widely misunderstood formula, which uses the word God in it, and it ends like this. And here's the other point. I can't bring myself to write it, the whole thing. So, and here's the other point of brilliance and brutal honesty of Nietzsche's diagnosis. The crisis of Western thought, this medical condition is defined as a condition that is essentially religious in character. That's why the world is sick, because apparently something very important is dead. The disease is specifically traceable to a physiological malfunction, a death as the formula says, somewhere in the God region of the brain. If an organ of thought is failing and atrophied, this is somehow bound up with a failure in our ability to think about God, to think God. Anyone who's actually read Nietzsche knows that this famous formula has very little to do with atheism as a philosophical position. That was Nietzsche's point. It's much more important than simply taking up a position of atheism. For one, the formula is a deliberately crafted bit of comedy. It's supposed to make you laugh. It's like saying Mars, the god of war, is a girly girl. She's a Schwarzenegger accent, right? He's a girly girl. Or Venus is a butch. Or the immortal ones are dead. And in French actually would sound better, les immortels sont morts, right, to bring out the contradiction of the terms. The immortals are morts, dead. In less jokey Nietzschean nomenclature, the place given to the word God is occupied by the term value. Thanks to Martin Heidegger's painstaking reading of Nietzsche, we know that the formula is really a synonym for another less rhetorical dramatic phrase, namely European nihilism. Let me just bring it up here. And I'll get to Nietzsche, back to that in a second. And I hope you don't mind. I'm taking it for granted that, I'm standing on Nietzsche's shoulders in order to make this point, but I'm also going to stand on Heidegger's shoulders because Heidegger is one of the great readers of Nietzsche. The fact that one of them was, came before Nazism and the one was basically a Nazi in 1933-34, we'll leave that on the back burner for a second, although it is related to the issue. The best and the clearest definition that Nietzsche gave for his notion of the death of the value called God, and that's why I'm giving it the full, what Nietzsche is really saying here in a non-joking fashion, is to be found in his last and unfinished work, so-called Will to Power. It's not really a work. And it runs as follows. Nihilism, as I write up here, nihilism, what is it? The aim is missing. The answer to why is missing. Warum? Warum des Lebens, as Viktor Frankl says, the why of life. What does nihilism mean? That the uppermost values have been devalued. The things that we hold most sacred, the values that are uppermost, they've been knocked down. That's what Nietzsche means by the value, God is dead. The uppermost values of Western civilization, Western thought, values like goodness, justice, humanity, and so on, among all of these, the uppermost value is, of course, called God. From which all of these values derive their value, their power. And all of these are, all the uppermost but not the uppermost values are ultimately suspended, or as Plotinus would say, are an overflow. Overflow is hypostatic emanations. And Plotinus here is, of course, the parallel to Lurianic Kabbalah. These values have become devalued. God, that is what Western civilization calls God, and I want to emphasize that, this is what the Western world calls God, the value it calls God is dead. It's a dead value. It's a bit of dead organ tissue, a value that no longer supports and participates in the vitality of the organism. The term God, in other words, is really code for the most vital idea of Western civilization, an idea whose functions are intimately and intrinsically bound up with the life of the European sciences, beginning with the humanities. And it matters little if the term God is knocked down by self-proclaimed thematically atheist styles of thinking, such as Enlightenment, rationalism, Marxism, positivism, existentialism, humanism, liberalism, whatever you have. In other words, in one way or another, all of the sciences, even when they're so-called atheist, they have what I would call a Neoplatonic organization. And I always found this very fascinating, actually, as an undergrad, going to the library, and I studied philosophy, and I just found it fascinating how the Library of Congress would actually classify its books. And I was very proud as studying philosophy that philosophy is right at the beginning. Philosophy and religion are right at the top, and there's a reason for this. And actually, Herbert Putnam, who in 1897 structured the American system of classification, came under criticism for not making it the organization even more clearly epistemological. To show, in other words, how the lower sciences are really derived from the upper sciences. Similar system is the Dewey Decimal System. Has more or less the same structure. Melville Dewey, a couple of years before Putnam, organized a system. Again, a similar way. It's interesting. Philosophy, psychology, and religion are at the top. We get the social sciences. This is what I find interesting. The humanities are even prior to science itself. But this is really an expression of what Plotinus is saying, and what the Arizal is saying also. This is how thought is. Thought has a certain structure, a tree-like structure, which is why it's so important to talk about God as the one idea that holds everything together. And as I say, you can say you're an atheist, but you're still going to have some idea that is sacrosanct, that is sacred. Examples, we mentioned psychology, and I wish I thought about this before. I heard this wonderful lecture on positive psychology. So if you leave aside William James for a second, and by the way, I think Viktor Frankl is another great example. The Rebbe had a relationship with Viktor Frankl. My friend Rabbi Biederman, my boss Rabbi Biederman in Vienna, can tell you firsthand that the Rebbe encouraged Viktor Frankl's approach to psychology precisely on these grounds, because it was positivistic. But psychology, let's talk about Freudian psychology. And insofar as all psychologies are affected by the Freudian approach, so there's a basic axiom in Freudian psychology. Well, there are a couple axioms. For example, health. Every psychologist wants to produce good health. We might question that from an intellectual standpoint. You could say, well, are you sure health is the best thing? Maybe some things are more important than your health. Maybe for some things you should do mesiras nefesh, which will compromise your health. Maybe you should even die, which is very bad for your health. Or in the Freudian system, for example, and I think a lot of psychology, although not the positivist, which is a strain of psychology, which I think should be encouraged, the general psychological approach is informed by Freud's emphasis on the id rather than on the superego. We need to save the poor id. The poor id is being smashed by all this religion, right? Religion is very top-heavy and says, don't do this and don't do that. We need to release the id, which of course is the exact upside down of what Balatania is trying to say. Perhaps, giving you another example, in economics, we take it as a basic principle in economics, an axiom, that we should achieve wealth. Why? Why is that important to achieve wealth? Does that mean I have 25 minutes or I mean?
You have 25.
I have 25, look at it. Another simple example, if we jump to politics for a second, political thinking, especially since the French Revolution, is influenced by this idea of égalité, fraternité, equality and fraternity. This is an axiom. It's an axiom that derives from a certain way of thinking, which from a Jewish standpoint is actually highly questionable, whether fraternity should be the model of politics. Maybe filiality is a more appropriate one. In physics, to give another example, in physics a very important axiom is elegance. Why did the Copernican revolution take place altogether? Why did Copernicus kick out Ptolemy? Because the Ptolemaic system with the crazy Martian epicycles was just not an elegant system. It lacked elegance. So for the sake of elegance, Copernicus was able to knock out Ptolemy. In other words, in one way or another, there's some type of uppermost value. There is some type of, even if you don't call it God, there's some type of uppermost value functioning. As long as such violence replaces the privileged position in the 19th century was occupied by the term God with some other sacred axiom, the serious questioning of which would be tantamount to intellectual sacrilege, the discipline is still God intoxicated, and hence still as devitalized and as toxic as its sacrosanct axiom. I'm going to have to jump here, see to the end, because I want to get to the Hasidic texts. Let's just give me a second to orient myself. First of all, we should point out, when we're talking about Plato, to get back to Plato, is the foundation of Western thought. Plato himself does not talk about the word God. He doesn't, certainly it's nothing like the word God the way that we use it in Judaism and so on. But his phrase, hetu agathu idea, the idea of the good, or the idea of the noble, that is what allowed for Christianity to translate what it found in the Torah into philosophical terms. So the idea of the good comes through Christianity, and that's the impact on the West is through Christianity, becomes replaced by the word God. And Nietzsche, just to give a quick, this is another axiom that I can't get into, we can get into in discussion, but Whitehead, the great American philosopher Whitehead once said, you know, all of philosophy, and therefore all of Western thought, is really footnotes to Plato. And it's not an accident, as I said, we are academics, and therefore we come from Plato. As academics, our ultimate origins are Platonic. In one way or another, all of academia is Platonism in one form or another. And Nietzsche, therefore, saw, when Nietzsche decided to take on the entire Western tradition of thought, he actually saw his task as what he called, he said, meine Philosophie umgedrehter Platonismus. My philosophy is a flipped over Platonism. Now, I think you can already anticipate the lines along which the Nietzschean overturning of Plato can give Judaism a fresh approach. Because after all, whether we're talking about Plato or about Nietzsche, here we're only talking about an idea. We're not talking about a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Kodesh Baruch Hu is not an idea. But Plato and Western thought translates HaKadosh Baruch Hu that it finds in the Torah into an idea. So the question is now, can we save this idea? Look, as Jews, it's always possible to argue, especially if you want to really be fanatical, to just throw out all of academic thought and to say, to hell with it, you know, let's just, na nachman, and just completely leave out all thought and just be emotional and be besimcha and so on. So it's possible, certainly historically, I guess it was possible to have Judaism without an idea of God. So why would we want to save the idea of God? I suggest for the simple and vital reason that Plato himself, before he was overturned by Nietzsche, was an overturner. And that as such, he may be quite indispensable for us. What I mean by that is that Plato, as you might know, in the Republic, which is probably Plato's single greatest work, one of the most important things that he accomplishes in the Republic is a critique of religion. Plato was given as his education, the education of all the Greeks at that time was Homer. In fact, Homer was called the great educator. And in Homer, you find a lot of unpleasant stories. I'm sure you know them. Zeus, Uranus and Kronos and Zeus that hold a triangle, castrating the father and raping the mother, and all these wild stories. And Plato said, how can you teach these horrible stories to children? This is really bad stuff. So let's censor Homer. Let's get rid of all of Homer. Now, this is a positive move, right? And we want to get rid of this type of very brutal avodah zarah. So for that reason, my question is, shouldn't we try to hold on to Plato? And can we do that? Can we do that with the help of Hasidus? And here I will jump just to the very end here to a reading of Plato. Plato spoke of ideas. That's his major contribution to language, actually. Idea is a Greek word, which means the way that something looks. It's another one of these words like academia that we use without knowing the origins of this word. The way that something looks. And the word idea in Greek is, as you can actually see, is related to the word eidolon, which means idol. Idol and idea are basically the same word. Which suggests that all of thought itself is in one way or another religious. This is an idea that was put forward, for example, by people like Paul Tillich, Max Scheler, who are phenomenologists, but we also mentioned earlier Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu did a systematic deconstruction of everything that he saw in the world. Is this God? Is this God? No. Is this God? No. Oh, so Kodesh Baruch Hu must be the infinite God. One way or another, one is fixated either on Hashem or on an idol. Or as one of my favorite singers, I believe he's a Chabadnik, a gentleman named Bob Dylan, says you're going to have to serve somebody. It may be the devil, or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Right? So you have a choice. You can't live without serving. There has to be some religious structure to your thinking. And the only question is, whom are you serving? Now here, just to get to Plato, and here I'm going to use Heidegger to read Plato, the genius of Plato and the genius of Plato and the basic move whereby Plato single-handedly established the basic parameters of what constitutes truth for academic thought. And here's, according to Heidegger, a shift from approaching truth as a kind of disclosure, hiddenness, aletheia in Greek, to grasping truth as a measure of correspondence or agreement, homoiosis, between knowledge and the thing known. Or in the famous phrase by Thomas Aquinas, veritas est adequatio intellectus et re. Intellectual thinking is an adequation between reality and thought. And Heidegger says, as unhiddenness, Unverborgenheit, as aletheia, says Heidegger, truth is still the basic trait of being themselves. As correctness of the glance, however, it becomes a distinction of human comportment to beings. What Heidegger rather is saying, he's saying, look, what was the main thing that happened? What was an amazing thing that happened in Plato? Prior to Plato, the word aletheia was good Greek word everybody used, truth, what is true. So he says, prior to Plato, aletheia meant that things reveal themselves to me. I don't know what it is, but it shows itself to me. Plato does an amazing feat. He says, look, from now on, we're going to say the truth is correctness of the gaze. Orthotes, right, like orthodontics and orthopedics. Correctness, you're directed towards an idea. You need to be, your mind is directed towards something. And if it's misdirected, then you have falsehood. By being inadequately directed to the right idea, you get what is the false. Heidegger is very critical of this whole Platonic tradition. He wants to get back to a kind of aletheia, which is what he calls unhiddenness. Truth, it's precisely when correctness has been achieved, it's then that the more primordial character of truth as disclosure has been dimmed down into an inconsequential background of irrelevance. Truth loses its meaning for life. What the correct idea lacks by comparison with truth as disclosure is the power to convince. Truth as aletheia is something that surrounds me bodily as being in the world, that's a term from Heidegger, as a clearing in which I'm standing. Within aletheia, I stand convicted of the truth, not just convinced in the sense that my mind is convinced by an idea somewhere out there in some bodily dimension. And here, I think, is where we can put in a wedge of Hasidic thinking. What do I mean by that? We have to look at what Plato, on what grounds did Plato hold that truth was correctness, and that it was possible to achieve truth, to come to what is true through correctness. What epistemic force did Plato attribute to this idea, which he believed could overcome the circles of doubt lying in wait? So Plato himself tells us, very simply, he says it's an erotic force. Actually, Plato uses this word, eros. Philosophy is erotic, by which he means one is drawn to the correct idea by its beauty. In one way or another, why are we convinced of something? There's something about the idea that is appealing. It says to us, yes, this is true, and we are drawn to it. And Plato himself explicitly says in a couple of places that thought has an erotic structure to it. We are turned on, as it were, by the thing. Now, of course, and here is the big problem. And now I'm going to turn to a couple of texts from Hasidus. What is the problem with knowledge which is structured in an erotic type of way? Very simply, that you can fall out of love as easily as you fall in love. Erotic and romantic love is organic. It dies a natural death. It can't last very long, naturally. So it's very natural, if a person pursues a type of eroticism, that one will become Don Juan, for example, a Casanova. And it's the same thing in the realm of the intellect. If one is an intellectual, an academic, one may be attracted to a certain idea. But if a nice looking idea comes along, and a few nice ideas come along, all the better. If I can be Shlomo Melech and have 1,000 different ideas, 700, 300 ideas, and they're all in my harem of ideas, so it's great. In other words, academic thinking by definition has a certain lack of commitment to it. Now, to turn very quickly, because I don't have much time here, to the Chabad texts, maybe I'll just jump over these very quickly. In the third chapter of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe provides us with his quick schema of Chochmah Bina Dat. Chochmah, as you probably know, is the infusion of the mind by, I guess, what Plato might call an idea. Somewhere between maybe what Plato would call wonder and an idea. The mind is blown away, falls in love. Say falls in love. with this idea. Then Bina is working through this idea systematically using critical thinking. And finally, he says, when the intellect that is in the intelligent soul critically contemplates and immerses itself deeply in the greatness of God, how he fills our world and so on, we actually looked at this text before, then one falls in love with God. He says, but here's the important part about that. He says, dat, the etymology of which is to be found in the verse, and Adam knew, Yada, his wife, Chava, implies attachment and union. That is, one binds his mind with a very firm and strong bond to it that firmly fixes his thought on the greatness of the blessed Ein Sof, without diverting his mind from it. This is what is unique in the Chabad epistemic. This thing is a Chabad epistemology. Because academic epistemology for sure has chokhmah of a sort. I want to emphasize, of a sort. It's not reducible to what the Alter Rebbe calls chokhmah. Has something like chokhmah, has something like bina, but it definitely does not have da'at. It does not have da'at. It does not have, by definition, it can't have da'at. Academic thinking has to be non-committal. If it's committed, then it's called dogmatism. But the Alter Rebbe is saying, look, if we're going to achieve a relationship with Kadosh Baruch Hu, you can't leave it at the level of bina, of critical thinking. There has to be hiskashus, hitkashrut, between the mind and the thing that is known. And it's not an accident. Again, you might think that I'm a pervert by mentioning, because I had, Zizek here mentioning eroticism and so on. But you can see the Alter Rebbe himself says very, very clearly. He says, where do we get the fundamental paradigm of da'at? It is the union between Adam and Chava. That is what da'at is. Da'at is not knowledge. That's a mistranslation. Da'at is intimacy. It's an intimate familiarity. And that's something that is not, it can't be achieved on the basis of eroticism and romance alone. Because eroticism and romance are like critical thinking. You can move on. Da'at is like getting married. So when you get married, so the eros is gone. Okay, so the eros is gone. Okay, we have to work on it now. The romance is gone. Okay, the romance is gone. We have to work on it now. It's not. The Don Juan option is not there. And the Alter Rebbe is saying that model of Adam and Chava, that binding, that's the model that we have to use in thinking. It's not just in sexuality and in relationships. Now, this is a text from Ein Tafresh from the Rebbe Rashab, and I'm sure I'm not going to be able to get through all these texts. But the Rebbe Rashab this year develops this idea very nicely in a couple of Maimarim. Over and over, he comes back to this idea. He says the root of the faculty of decision and resolve belongs to da'at in particular, because the intellect and reasoning, taken by themselves, can still change. And one cannot yet know by this the resolution of the matter. Reasons, so just to jump here, reasons are brought forth to this side and that side. Initially, these reasons give force, and afterwards the situation turns around. And other reasons gain force. And it can happen, the situation will flip over a number of times. This is not an insult to reason. This is not an insult to Bina. Bina is supposed to operate this way. It's supposed to be open-minded. That's how understanding works. That's how academic thinking works. You have to be open-minded. He says, but that cannot come to resolve. On the basis of understanding, you cannot come to what Heidegger would call Entschlossenheit, resolution. And he gives another text where he points this out. He says, look, again, this is not a mistake. We have text from the Talmud, from Midrash Tehillim. It says when the Torah was given, it was not given as clear cut. Milim chatuchim. Things were not clear cut when God gives the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu. In fact, everything was given, as Midrash says, with 49 aspects of interpretation. Is it pure? Is it impure? You know the story of Rabbi Akiva's student who was able to prove in 49 ways that a sheretz was kosher. Right? So it's not by accident that oh my gosh, he can actually prove this way, or there's a way to look at things from a different angle. That's the actual structure of Binah. That's what Hashem intends for the world to be open-ended this way, for the Torah to be open-ended, for there to be many possible interpretations. That's why we have the famous phrase that people always quote, both Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai, words of the living God, Divrei Elokim Chai. Right? That's not a mistake. There's supposed to be different ways of looking at things, but there also has to be a psak. And a psak has to get beyond these different ways of looking at things. When you're thinking through, that's bina, but the psak has to come from da'at. And that, the Rebbe Rashab, he likens it to hergesh. He says it's a sensitivity. You have to feel it. There's a recognition. And he says, look, for example, if you look, how am I doing for time? Am I over?
No, you have 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes. Oh, okay, so I'm rushing too fast. Yeah. So He says, think for example of a young bucky, a young guy in yeshiva. He's not bar mitzvah yet. He has a photographic memory. He knows Shas backwards and forwards, Tosfos, Rashi, and everything. But we don't hold him halachically responsible. We say, okay, for sure he knows all the halachas about everything, but he's potter, right? He's not halachic. You can't take him. He's not punishable, right? He's not punishable. Why? Because he's not 13 yet, and so it doesn't matter what he knows. What he knows is nice in theory at the level of binah. He has a good theoretical, critical grasp of the text, but he's not yet married to it. Yeah, that comes with age. Age is actually a factor here. Then, this is still from the Rebbe Rashab. The issue of choice belongs precisely to that. As they say, if there's no knowing, where do we get separation? To separate two things, to choose one of them, enjoyment from disgust and so on, that requires dat. So dat itself, same theme here, right? It's the ability to choose requires dat, the ability to actually make a choice. From the perspective of seichel alone, seichel, in other words, without dat, one cannot come to a resolution. This is a text that I want to thank Eli for bringing me this text from the Rebbe. He says there has to be if there's going to be some type of resolution in the way we understand things, it can't be on the basis of chokhmah bina. It has to be only by means of dat, which enters into the depths of something. It can come to a resolution regarding an action, and this is why it's written, and choose life. After all, even though it was already said, look, I am setting before you life and sorrow, chaim and mavet. So it says, even though God says, look, I'm giving you a choice, death or life, what do you want? So you would think it's kind of obvious, death or life, chaim, mavet, everybody chooses life. But Rebbe says, don't be so smart. You might think so, but actually, it's possible to choose death. Well, look at Freud, for example. Freud, the Jenseits von Lustprinzip, the beyond the pleasure principle. One of Freud's main theses is that the human being naturally wants to die, and that life is a kind of long roundabout way of getting to death. So choosing life is not an easy matter. It has to be a achlata, it has to be a decision to choose life, and that's something that can only be done on the basis of dat. Choose life, he says, comes about by means of dat. Well, how does this happen? Answer to the question. The answer is the dat binds idea and thought, in other words, chokhmah and bina, which is why dat itself is above idea and thought. Indeed, dat receives from the faculty of Keter. And this was my original title for this piece, was Keter. So in order to understand how dat operates, because on the basis of chokhmah and bina alone, you could never come to this choosing of life. The only way is that has some kind of direct connection to Keter. And just to show the rest of this little text here, this is jumping back to the Rebbe Rashab. This is the beginning of this set of Maimonim. He says, and this is actually my favorite text of all of them, because this brings us right back to the beginning of history. What is Eitz Hadat versus Eitz HaChaim? There's a fundamental tension, a dialectical tension between these two trees. These two forces that Hashem creates the world with. On the one hand, there's the force that is pure life. Is it an intelligent force? Well, maybe, maybe not. The main thing is that it's pure life. It's a living force. It's vital. And then there's a tree, a separate tree, which is dat. Eitz hadat tovera. So you say, what's called tree of knowledge, dat of good and evil, is that which separates and refines. Mavar and mavdil, the good from the bad. In any event, after the separation of the bad is realized, room is thereby made for the very existence of the bad. So the tree of knowledge, which distinguishes good from bad, which you would think is a good thing to be able to distinguish, to make the havdalah, mavarer, mavdil, right? It clarifies, yes, it clarifies and distinguishes good from evil, but, he says, through this tree, room is made for the very existence of Ra. The very understanding of Ra is what makes possible the existence of Ra, of badness. That's why it's a dangerous tree. Not because Chas v'Shalom, thinking is bad in and of itself, but somehow thinking generates the very possibility of badness. And this essential refinement, berur, takes place by means of the tree of life in particular. So this is so, since the tree of knowledge belongs to the category of the distribution along the lines of chesed and gvura, from which a category of goodness and badness devolve. But the tree of life is above the category of distribution altogether. There's no way whatsoever to grasp it. Once it's from there that the essential refinement comes from the tree of life, refines the tree of knowledge. The tree of knowledge, Etz Hadat Tovra, is refined. The only way you can properly make use of the da'at that is embodied in the metaphysical principle of the Etz Hadat, the only way you can do it properly is with the Etz HaChaim. Without Etz HaChaim, it's a very dangerous piece of equipment. A little bit, I would love to get into this, but we're not going to get into today. If you know your Derrida, what Derrida calls the pharmakos, which is pharmakos in ancient Greek can be translated as both poison and medicine. It's both. In most language, I mean, we know that medicine is poisonous, right? It's always funny, in German, say gift in German is poison. In English, of course, it's a gift. There are certain things in this world that are, just maybe a little story that you guys might know. Family comes into Yechidus with the Rebbe, and they have all kinds of questions for the Rebbe. A little girl, 5 years old, has a question for the Rebbe. And the parents are shutting her up, saying, no, don't bother the Rebbe with the question. The Rebbe sees that she has a question. Okay, the family is now walking out of the room, and the Rebbe says, wait a minute, little girl has a question. What's your question, little girl? She says, Rebbe, is nuclear energy dangerous? 5-year-old girl. The Rebbe says, very brilliant question, very smart. So he says, I'll ask you a question. In your kitchen, there's a knife. Is that knife dangerous? The little girl says, well, Rebbe, it depends. The Rebbe says, the same thing, it depends. The tree of knowledge, Eitz Hadat Tovra, it depends. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is academic thinking good or bad? It depends. It depends how you're using it. It depends if it's connected to the tree of life. If it has no connection to the tree of life, it could be good. You could have a nice phase in history where it's on the upswing, everybody's reading Plato and feeling very spiritual and so on. And then as Professor Riedel said earlier, you can have a crash. Right? Suddenly all this beautiful intellectualism leads to all kinds of orgiastic behavior. So it depends. It depends. This is a power that can swing either way. What's needed is commitment. And here's my last slide here, just to put it all in a nice big fancy picture. Thinking in terms of organs here, the brain, if we separate, on the one hand, the power of chokhmah, which I would translate as a wonderful idea, an idea full of wonder. Again, basing myself on Plato and Aristotle, that wonder is the origin of all thinking. And if, on the other hand, we have critical thinking, and this is us, academics over here, with the power of Binah, so the only way we can connect these things to life is through da'at, which I'm translating as intimate familiarity. And here's the key, and this is the thing that is so upsetting it has to be upsetting for an academic. If you're not upset by this, you have to think that I'm a fanatic and a dogmatist. And if you don't, there's a real problem, because I'm trying to make a dogmatic point here. And you think, oh yeah, he's just, I'm deliberately trying to make a fanatical point. That's the whole point. If you don't see the fanaticism here, you're missing something, right? So, in other words, it's vitally prejudiced. It's prejudiced. Critical, the word critical from Greek, like everything comes from the Greeks, right? Krinein means judgment, criticism. Judicious. An academic is judicious. He's thoughtful. A chassid, he's judicious. He has chokhmah bina. But bottom line is no, he's prejudiced. Prejudicious. Prejudicious. Has to be a prejudice in his thinking. If he's not prejudiced, then he's a thinker. He's a good academic. But if his thinking is going to be rooted in life, there has to be a fundamental, vital prejudice. Otherwise, he's not connected to life. And again, as the Rebbe so nicely says, how do we get this wonderful prejudice? Well, that's Keter. Keter, besides making a tortuous, roundabout, circuitous route that goes through Chokhmah, then Bina, and then down to Da'at, Keter also has a direct influence on Da'at. And that direct link is literally and etymologically speaking vital. That's the only way to get to vitality. Thank you.